So it's about unconventional in our regulatory framework. And what we were really hoping to do is make this an update. So that would assume that you know all the front end and we just concentrate on the back end. But I think from what I've heard in some others that there's a need to keep reinforcing why are we doing this. So the first part of the discussion is going to talk a little bit, why is there need for a change? Why do we need a new regulatory framework? Because if we can't articulate the need for a change, then it's really hard to understand why should I be going through the motions. If you don't believe that we should be changing because you don't know what the business driver is, then we're going to lose you on the next two pieces. And the next two pieces are, what is the change? What are we looking at? And the final piece is, why do I care? How does it impact on me? And by me, that could be the folks in this room, the rest of the folks in the ERCB, but it's also our external partners, so government, industry, and landowners. There's three significant components, and each one of those could probably be a 2-hour presentation in itself. So I'll walk through some of it fairly quickly. First off, this gives a bunch of pieces here that'll help determine what a conventional reservoir is, and that's critical. If you know what a conventional is, then the unconventional makes more sense. But the two big things there to keep in mind is that in a conventional reservoir, it's got good porosity and permeability, and the key difference is the permeability piece. And what that is just the ability for fluids to flow through rock. So you get pores that the fluids are trapped in, and they can be trapped in those pores, but if there's no connections between the pores, the fluid doesn't flow. So you drill a well into a conventional reservoir, a good conventional reservoir, and fluids rush to that well bore, and in the worst case scenario, you can have a blowout. So when that happens, you know you got a conventional reservoir. On an unconventional reservoir, you may have that porosity, but there's essentially no permeability. So you drill a well into that, nothing happens. So somehow you have to stimulate flow. And then if we were talking about oil sands, the reason the stuff won't flow is because it's too viscous. So you need to apply some sort of something to loosen it up, and usually it's thermal energy. In this case, it's light enough to flow. Methane will flow, but there's no pore spaces. So you have to develop those pore spaces, and that's where hydraulic fracturing comes in. And Ron McDonald here, if you haven't all signed up for his piece, is going to explain what horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. So this one I do spend a bit of time on if people aren't really too comfortable what the difference is, but it shows a classic reservoir, although much deeper than what this depicts. And if you're looking at the shale seal or the shale on the left, often those shales, if it's a good organic rich shale, are our source rock and to fill these reservoirs, and now we're going after source rock in the unconventional world. But the difference here is that fluid can move up and down within those three colors, and the reason there's three colors there is because they're different densities, and gas sits on top of oil, it sits on top of water. And I generally bring a little jar, I call my lawyer jar, I don't think there's any lawyers in the room, to show what that looks like. Because you can tilt it any way you want, but you always get those layers. You can shake it, and they'll eventually still layer out. And that's exactly what happens in a conventional reservoir, and fluids are able to move through it. So that's what the difference between them. So what? So why do we have to change the way we do our business? And there's on a previous slide I've had in presentation, there's a whole raft of different criteria that says these are the reasons why I want to change. But it really fundamentally comes down to two things that have changed that we need to pay attention to. And one of them is advancing the technology itself. So you've heard about horizontal drilling, and you've heard about multi-stage hydraulic fracturing. And it's the combination of those, it's allowed access to reservoirs that we couldn't produce before. And so that really started horizontal drilling's been around in Alberta since about the 80s, early 80s. Hydraulic fracturing's been around since the 1950s. But the combination of those two technologies really started in the United States for shale gas, and that was it started in the 1990s, but really took off in about 2004. That kind of technology is being applied in Alberta, started in late 2008 and into 2009. So it's relatively recent. And our numbers on it are, we've had 171,000 wells hydraulically fractured in Alberta, starting in about 1950. And the last count as about a week ago, we've had about 4,200 wells that fit that category of horizontal and multi-stage hydraulically fracked. It's the technology, that's number one that sets it apart. But that, as I mentioned, that technology is not just exclusive to, it can be, right now it's being applied to our conventional reservoirs, so it can be applied to any reservoir. It doesn't have to be just shale gas. And so we start off with this project looking at shale gas, but we quickly realized it's being used in our oil reservoirs and some of our, what have been historically our conventional oil reservoirs. So it can be used in any reservoir. But it's the second piece too, that is different. That is really where our focus for URF is going to go, and it's the scale of the resource. So there's a big difference in the size of the resource from an unconventional, and I'll try to describe that in the next slide. And then the piece we already talked about is that these new resource plays lack permeability, so that ability to flow. So three things that have made the change. One is new technology, the size and scope of these things, and the other is you need something to get that fluid out, and you need to crack it up, you need to artificially create permeability, and that's what the hydraulic fracturing process does. I threw this one in to give a sense of the scope and scale, because that's one of the ones that I think people scratch their heads a little bit about. This is a snapshot in time of deposition of material. So you have to imagine that when we get around to drilling a well through this, you've added a few million years and probably a few kilometers of sediment sitting on top of this. So it's a snapshot of what was going on. But when you look at these things like a delta, and if you can imagine yourself walking along your favorite beach on this delta, this would be a great conventional reservoir, as would these barrier bars, which are sands just offshore. And then if you have reef buildup and you can snorkel through the reef, those are our true conventional reservoirs. That's good reservoir quality rock typically. And if you look at the size of these, which you can't really get a sense of, but they're relatively small. So even in the subsurface, when we're exploring for those, they may be a mile or 2 miles in length and maybe a few hundred kilometers in width, relatively small. The rock we're talking about when we get into resource plays or shale plays is what is typically deposited way out here. So at the time this is deposited, it's marine deposition. So it's very, very fine sediment that gets carried way out into the ocean, settles to the ocean floor, gets mixed in with plankton and other organic matter, and builds this layer of, if it's in a perfect scenario, organic rich muds. And then you pile a bunch of stuff on top of that. Eventually it gets compressed and under pressure and temperature converts into shale. And if you've kept that organic matter, it's organic rich, beautiful source rock for your oil and gas to form. But the thing to note is the size and scale. So where these may have only been a section or half a section in size, these things can be townships in size. So they're not hard to find. The old days, exploring for these was difficult. When you're out looking for a conventional pool, the trick was to find one. Once you found one, it's easy to produce the fluids. And when we're looking for resource plays, we know where they are in the subsurface. We've got lots of wells that have drilled through them, so it's not hard to find them. The trick is to figure out how to get the fluids out. And that's where hydraulic fracking has come in. The fluids are in there, it's trapped, and that allows it to be released to the wellbore. So, but it's the scale that is so different than anything we've had to deal with before. So this one is, this would be as good as reservoir rock you'll ever see. It's very porous. You can probably even from the back see little holes in it. I'll pass it around. It's very permeable, and I test that, and hopefully nobody's from this room is watching, but if you pour water in one of the top holes, it dribbles out the floor. So all these little pore spaces are all connected, and that's where the permeability comes in. There's a view that our reservoirs are big caverns underground, but they're not. This is the best you'll ever see. So I'll pass around, you get a sense of what Greg's seen this before, so it's not new to him. And then a more typical reservoir in Alberta would be a sand reservoir. Same sort of thing, it's got porosity and permeability. I can pour water on. It'll eventually soak in. You probably won't get to see it fall through, but it's already starting to. I'll pretend it's soaking here, I'll pass it on. And then finally, if you take a shale like this, I won't even bother pouring water on because all it'll do is make the surface wet. It'll never soak through. We could sit here miss our supper and a lot more, and that water is not going to soak through this rock simply because it lacks permeability. So the project itself, what were we trying to do? We were asked to do this back in late 2009 by the board, and the board was pretty clear. They're not looking at tweaking the old regulatory framework. They wanted a new regulatory framework. And so that's been our challenge, is to look at the framework that currently exists, which I think by most accounts we have had. And the more work we do with other jurisdictions, the more we're hearing that we've probably got, if not the best, we're in the top 2 or 3 best regulators for understanding this stuff in the world. So we want to be careful not to turf out all the good stuff that we've been developing for 75 years and come up with something that may create more problems than we fix. So that's been the challenge, is how do we do that? And it started off, our goal then, without reading all this, is to come up with something that is as effective as we've had, but more efficient. And part of that goes to the scope and scale. A lot of the risks that we've seen are no different in the new world as they were in the old. It's just there's a lot more of it. So to be efficient, how do we manage all that extra work? So it applies to all these things are to be considered to be conventional, CBM, tight oil, shale gas, and shale oil. We're not defining what unconventional is. It's a moving target. And at one time, oil sands was considered to be unconventional, but most people don't think of it that way anymore. We always get asked, how come you're not including oil sands? And we aren't, because there's another strategy, another board a strategic objective that's focused on oil sands. Now, the one thing we are doing, and we've got Kim in the room here, Kim has been working with the oil sands, mapping their processes and helping them move forward. And she's also now working on our stuff too. And we've talked a lot with the oil sands folks. What we don't want to have happen is two completely different regulatory regimes coming out of this building that look like one was done in Nigeria and one in Quebec or something. We want them to look like ERCB products. But there are differences, and we want to respect the differences between the way you develop oil sands and how you develop some of this other stuff. So that when we started the project, the first thing we did is looked at what are the risks of unconventional development, and primarily with shale gas, and are they different than conventional? So we started by looking at other jurisdictions to try to understand what was going on. There was a lot of shale gas development in the United States. That's really where it started, in the Barnett Shale in Texas. BC was ahead of us because they were developing shale gas. And to this day, we don't have much shale gas development in this province. I think there's about a total of something like 250 wells, and a dozen of those are horizontal wells. And the reason is because gas is just too cheap, and nobody's going to spend that kind of money on those kind of wells. So where the development is going is into natural gas liquids, because lots of money to be made there, and looking at our conventional oil reservoirs. And that's why the activity in Alberta is focused on those. We'll likely get to shale gas when the prices go up, and whether that's, depending on who you want to listen to, could be 2 or 3 years, or it could be 2 or 3 decades. There's a lot of variables on that one. But it doesn't really matter. The activity is here now. It's using that technology. There are some subtle differences, and we can talk a bit about those. So the first step was looking at the risk. What are the risks? And we did it through our own work, plus surveying other jurisdictions. And then once we've understood what those risks are, then we looked at what do we want to achieve. So if we want to mitigate, what are these risks do we need to mitigate? And which ones are we willing just to accept the way they are? So what outcomes do we want? And that we thought would be pretty straightforward, and I don't think we've still got that one quite right. And then the framework design, we've come up with that, and those two pieces are complete. And then the third piece is implementing, and we'll hopefully, that would have been most of this talk, but there's some of this upfront stuff I think we need to make sure we understood. So I'll go through these, and I think some of the folks in this room have seen these slides before, so kind of a little bit old news. So I'll go through them quickly for those that haven't, and make sure you got a chance to ask questions. So first step was looking at what are the risks, and we ended up with initially 3 broad buckets of risks that you had to think about that were at a scale that was different than conventional. And the first one is around water management and protection. We'll talk a little bit more what that is. The second one we had called hydraulic fracturing, and all the stuff that's associated with the things that can go wrong with hydraulic fracturing. We've since changed that to containment, which means making sure that everything that goes down a wellbore or comes back up a wellbore stays within the wellbore, and anything injected into a formation stays within that target formation. That's the goal. So what could cause that to go wrong on us? And then the third is a big one, and that's the impact on the landscape. So what is the cumulative impact of this kind of development? And then finally, one that we added at the end was the whole question around communication. And that's both from an internal point of view, making sure people understand, but certainly on the external side, things like hydraulic fracturing have gotten into the media, they've gotten into the public's mind, and it's taken off. And I think that's one area, had we been able to roll back the bus a little bit on this, we would have addressed some of the communication piece a lot better than we would. Lots of information out there. Lots of access now with social media, but a lot of it's not very good information. There's a lot of misunderstood stuff going on. The other thing on this slide to point out, I'm not sure if I have another one similar, so I'll just check. Nope. So I'll point it out now. One of the questions that comes back at us all the time is the concern about contamination of groundwater because of the depth that this activity is occurring. So the point of this slide is a typical water well, and this is roughly to scale. Unfortunately, with the lighting and the size of the thing, you don't really get a sense of it. But a typical water well in Alberta is drilled to less than 50 meters. And there's a few that may make it as much as 100 meters. So it's very shallow. Our depth of groundwater protection and there's a little wiggly line on here that demonstrates that, is about, it's at what's is considered to be 4,000 milligrams per liter total dissolved solids, and that runs in the range of, I think, somewhere around 150 meters roughly to 650 meters, but well below where potable water is typically drawn, and at salinities well below what you would typically drink. So that's what's protected. Now, as you keep on going deeper, you're going to encounter water, but it becomes saltier and saltier until you get down to formations we typically produce oil and gas from, and the salinity of the water is greater than seawater, many times greater, and some depending on how deep you go. So as a rule of thumb, deeper you go, saltier the water, and the less usable it becomes. And the depths that we're looking at for this type of development, horizontal wells, multi-stage fracking, is in Alberta right now, it's about 650 to somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,500 meters. And the shallower ones, from 650 to 2,500, are on our typical oil pools, and they're not using the really big fracks. So the kinds of hydraulic fracking you hear about in the Barnett Shale or in the Horn River Basin in BC are in shales, and they're big slick water fracks. And we don't have much of that kind of activity in the province, and where we do, it's going to be deeper. It's in things like the Montney Formation and the Duvernay, and the Duvernay's the sweet spot is about 3,000 meters. So it gives you a sense of how deep this is below our groundwater. So we don't have to worry necessarily about direct communication coming up for a variety of reasons. And I could spend, this is a fun slide, I could spend an hour on it, but I'll move it along. So on the water side, the issues that come up, clearly the water volumes that are being used. And if you look at Pennsylvania and Horn River, they can be into is something like 80,000 cubic meters per well. So in the worst case scenario, it's like taking 36 Olympic-sized swimming pools and sending it down the wellbore. We're not seeing those size of fracs in Alberta, mainly because of the target zones. You can use anywhere from 0, if it's something like a propane frac, up to, we're hearing 4,000 to 5,000 cubes. But if we move into some of these big resource plays, and similar to that diagram I showed, when you're in the Duvernay or the Montney, then we can potentially see some very large volumes. And whether they're large or not, it's the number of wells that are necessary to drill these things too becomes pretty big. So if you start multiplying it up, you're getting into big volumes. So that's an issue with the public. It's an issue no matter what the size is. As a rule, nobody wants to see good potable water going down one of these wellbores, being contaminated and being brought back to surface. So that's an issue. The other is the potential to contaminate groundwater. And there's sort of three ways that potentially could happen. 2 have happened in other jurisdictions. And one was related to this casing and cement. So no cement in the wellbore, improper cementing, and methane migrates into the wellbore up and into an aquifer. And that's been documented in Pennsylvania and is shown in, I think it was Ohio, where it blew a house up. So the water well in the house, and boom. And by the way, I don't think in Alberta you're allowed to put your water well in your house anymore. It has to be outside. And partially for the reason is that methane exists in Alberta at virtually from right at the base of your feet all the way down. So it's there no matter what in all strata. It's just a different concentration. So the regulatory solutions, the fun part. So this is where the big change is. This is where URF looks different than the conventional world. And it really is the first piece, that when we looked at the risks, the difference between what we saw in conventional and unconventional is that the risks around things like water management, how you deal with those water issues, and how you deal with the big footprint are regional issues. They're not a well by well. So the way we currently work, if you want to drill a well, you come in with a well license application, you get it approved, and away you go. And if you want a pipeline, you come in with your pipeline application, away you go. We do it on a one entity at a time, and we do it reactively, waiting for that applicant to come in. What we're suggesting here is that kind of an approach, when you've got regional issues, doesn't allow you to handle those regional issues. So you got to ramp it up, and you got to look at it from a regional perspective, and hence from a play point of view. When we went into this, the odd man out was the hydraulic fracturing, which was the third issue, which we were looking at more on a well-by-well basis. And it was Ron sitting up here at the front that said, well, you might want to rethink that a little bit, because the rationale for that is that every formation or every play is going to be completed differently depending on the characteristics, which is everything from the depth, the geology, the types of fluids that are going to be produced. They can all be different, which means how you construct those wellbores, how you construct your hydraulic fracs could be different, and the risks posed by that can be different. So it was kind of an aha for me, but it also made it even make more sense that it'd be tied into the play base. So there's some rationale where even that piece, which we were thinking it was being a one-off, is not really a one-off. We want operators to design their whole wellbore construction and their completion strategy, keeping in mind the risks related to the formation they're producing in. So a simple example, if you're producing oil out of a conventional pool like the Cardium here west of Cochrane, it's normal pressure, but a lot of these source rocks, like the organic rich shales that they're going after, and they've been doing this with the Bakken in North Dakota, tend to be overpressured. So from a risk perspective, that introduces a bunch of different things. So how you would handle your completion strategy in a Viking well versus a Duvernay that's overpressured is going to be different. And as an operator and as us as a regulator, we want them to understand there's a difference and make sure that they take that into account to minimize risk. Otherwise, you have casing failures and all kinds of wonderful things go wrong. This is a hard slide to talk to, but it does get to the essence of what's different in the old world to what's different in the new world. So I've already talked about our traditional focus is entity-based. So we wait until somebody comes in with a well license or a pipeline or a facility. They get their application, away they go. And we're suggesting this new one's going to be play-focused. So we're going to look at it from a broader point of view. And these things all kind of trickle together. So it moves us out of that reactive mode, waiting for an operator to come in, into a more of a proactive mode where we're going to say to them, if you're developing this play, you need to come in with a plan, a project plan or a play plan. And there's some subtle differences of what those are, and I'll get into that. So we're looking at more of a planning process. Single performance, operator performance versus collective. And I've shown this slide to some of the industry folks, and they like most of the stuff to this point, but that one causes them to kind of glare at me a little bit as to, well, what exactly you're saying. But what it's getting at is if we're looking at a play that uses a lot of water, we may want to manage the water for the entire play, or if it covers a whole water basin, manage how that's being used. And if we see that it's not working well, the performance of that's going to reflect back on all operators. Now there may be a couple bad apples in the batch, but the idea is that we're going to manage water on a broader scale than looking at every single well and every operator. And performance of how that play is going will be reflected by the performance of how well the water overall is being managed, and we'll work from there. So it's quite a different approach than we've used in conventional before. If we're looking at plays, and every play being different, we're going to probably need different data for different types of plays. And so we're going to factor that in somehow. And it's probably going to be different depending on the life cycle where you are within the play. Exploratory to full commercial production, we may want different kinds of data. And so that's one industry is quite interested in going down that road. So how does it all work? And this is where industry really sits up in their chairs to see, well, how are you going to actually pull all this off? And as I mentioned, we start off with the existing requirements still apply, so we're not abandoning those. The first thing that we would do, that we're talking about doing is, and we've got some work going on right now, is looking at pad approval. So rather than getting approval for individual wells, if you're going to drill a pad with whatever number of wells, 4, 8, 16, and all the normal infrastructure that goes on that, you can get one approval. And you don't have to drill the wells in any particular time period, but once you've drilled them, and this is, we haven't landed here because there's some legal pieces we have to work on too. Once the well is drilled or any other activity is complete, you register that activity with us. So you notify us that you're complete. And so we get all the normal data we would. But what it does is it gives them flexibility around timing of these operations. And sometimes it's really difficult to time them, particularly if you've got multiple pads and not enough drilling rigs, for example. This gives them that flexibility, and it reduces repetitive work for them and for us. So a lot of this is just, you do it once, you don't have to do the exact same thing 4 or 8 or 16 times. So it's reducing, get rid of that repetitive. And this one seems a bit like a no-brainer. We think it reduces our workload, reduces industries, and from a landowner perspective, it's the information overload to get the big package from us on the first well, and then the second well, they get another exact same package, except some part of the well location is changed by a minor amount because you skidded the rig over 12 meters, and then on and on and on. So that gets old fast too for landowners. So we think this is really one of the few that's a big win-win for everybody. But it can apply outside of a play. We're suggesting once this is developed, you can apply it anywhere in the province. It doesn't just have to be in a play. So once we get into the play piece, the first thing we'll do is we'll go through a process to declare a play, which is similar to what we do with declaring a pool today. Same idea, it's just upscaled. And we're not going to create hundreds of plays through the province our view is there are probably something like 400 potential plays in the province, but we may only ever declare a dozen or a couple dozen. It'll be on those bigger resource plays that this type of an approach makes the best sense to manage. So it won't be everywhere. And then once we've declared a play, then those operators that want to operate within that play must abide by the new play rules. And there's a set of requirements that go with those. And it really is around developing plans, project plans and play development plans. And there's 5 areas that they have to address in those plans. And I'll get into what those are in a second, but this is a more from an impact. And one of the things we're trying to point out to folks too, this new technology, as much as it raises new risks, it also gives us huge opportunities. So it does, in a way, minimize the impact on the landscape. So to give you a bit of an idea, the kind of the rough rule of thumb people use is that one vertical well, the production from one vertical well would equal production of one frac in a multi-fracked horizontal leg. So just for illustration, if you take, let's see what I got, okay, 8 horizontal wells here on one pad, and some operators are telling us they may go 16, they may even go as high as 32. One company's adamant that in southern Alberta, if things pan out, they could put 32 wells on a pad. So if you're looking at 8 wells on a pad with 12 stages of frac, which is about average in Alberta now, they run from 10 to 20. There's areas in other jurisdictions have gone to 40, so it can go more. But if you look at 12, so now you've got equivalent of 96 fracs on that section, which would be equivalent to 96, very roughly, 96 vertical wells. And if you look at the area that takes out, even though the area for a pad is bigger than it is for a single well, the total area for these was about 40,000 cubic meters. If you took the equivalent and over here, well, this actually only shows 30 wells, so I'm saying that would be 96 to be equivalent. There's 30 showing there. But if you took those 96 and developed this as vertical wells, now you've gone from 40,000 cubic meters of space for the lease pads to 1.3 million. And a section of land is only 25. So essentially you've taken half the section out, and that doesn't count things like lease roads and pipelines. And that's if you put 8 wells on. If you go to 16, well, then you can see what just happened to that section of land, and nothing else is going to occur on that section because you've obliterated it with lease pads and roads. So the point of all that is horizontal wells, and the longer the reach, the better. And some companies are getting to the point where they think they can put one pad and drain 4 sections, that's even better. So 4 sections of land, which is 4 miles by 4 miles. Is that right? Yep. Lot less impact on the. So implementation approach. So this is how are we doing it. So if you got a bit of a sense now on what we're trying to do, we're trying to set up a risk-based approach, and we're doing it by play. And what we're doing is saying to companies, once we declare a play, you must come up with a plan. Either a project plan, or if we can convince them to get together, you come up with a play plan, and you must address these particular areas to our satisfaction. We're not going to tell you how, we're just saying you must address them in whatever you think makes the most sense. So where we are now is trying to figure out how is that actually going to work? How do we accept the plan? Who looks at it? What needs to be in the plan? How do we know whether we should approve or deny it? All of those, getting into the detail now. So the way we've done it, we've got 12 sub-teams internally, and on the next slide I'll show what they look like. But the thing to point out, and this is one that comes back to us as well, is this is a project out of RDB, which is my branch, and it's not. This has been to this point, and a piece that we really want to make clear. This project is an enterprise-wide one, and when you look at the people working on these plans, I think we've got Carol sitting in the back is probably the only one from my branch that's full-time on it, and now we have some full-time players on the project that are from other branches. So it's really a cross-branch project. And I think I've got most of the branches that are involved in there, except I forgot legal on there. But they're heavily involved as well. And we've been working heavily with what was Alberta Environment Water, which is now Environment Water and SRD all rolled into one. And we have to renew that discussion with them. So how does it work? There's these 12 teams. A very busy slide, but just to give you a sense of what they're doing. The bubbles that are in dark orange are teams that are up and running. So Mark had asked about the compliance piece, and it's one of the bubbles that's shaded in towards the end because we don't have a team lead on that one. We haven't got that team up and running yet, but it's one that we have to do. So if they're in orange, we've got a team lead, and we've got the teams either at various degrees. Some are well on their way, and some are kind of ramping up. So the teams the way the diagram works is coming in from the left is the framework design. It's done. So what the diagram is showing is the implementation piece, and when we get to the end of the diagram, we're really happy because we're complete and we can take a day off. So that's what we're striving for. So where we are is, first step is we've identified the risks. We're moving into risk mitigation. What do we need to do to mitigate those risks? A variety of teams. The water management team is one that we've got Alberta Environment folks working right on the team, and they're meeting, I think today, in Red Deer on a bunch of this stuff. So they're working away. We've got a technical operations team that's Hal Knox is leading, that's looking at technical issues in the well. And some of the life cycle wellbore integrity stuff comes out of that, and we're working with Ron on. Reservoir management, surface issues, we don't have anybody working on at the moment. Life cycle wellbore integrity, which is kind of related to this, and we don't really have a separate one for that, but they're rolled in together. But once we kind of figure out how we want to mitigate the risk, then we have to pull it all together into some sort of a process. So we form all it into something like an application that would come in, or a project plan that would come into the board. And what these folks are looking at is, how does that work? So the first ones they're looking at are, how do you do a PAT approval? And then they're going to look at, how do you declare a play? What's all the pieces around that? And then what do we do with a project or a play plan? What goes into it? Who looks at it? All the process related to that. And then when they're done, we look at the regulatory response. So what requirements need to change, and how are we going to structure those requirements? So we're talking about a management-based approach rather than prescriptive regulation. And we're really good at writing new regulations and new directives, and away we go. So we're suggesting performance-based or management-based, which is another topic. But what does that actually look like, and what does it mean, and how would you structure those requirements? So that's what these folks are going to do, and they're working. And then before we unleash this on the world and it goes amok on us, we want to test it. So the testing is being done in a team called the Duvernay team that we have a team lead, and we're getting the rest of the team built almost as we speak. And we have another team that's looking at performance measures and indicators. And that's a critical one, because what we're saying, if we're going to allow management-based process, we're going to tell companies what the objectives are. Now we have to figure out whether they're meeting them, and what are good performance measures. How do we know? And that's what these folks are doing. And then the compliance piece that we don't have yet, and then ultimately the final delivery of what URF looks like. What we don't want to do is have a 4,000-page directive called directive whatever going out as a new directive. We're looking at a quite different approach to how we get that out. So we're really looking at combining more of a life cycle process with an education process and a bunch of other stuff all into one. Now, we've got some thoughts of what that might be, a lot more web-based than what we've been used to, but there's a fair bit of work that needs to go into that. And then when that's all done, it pops out at the end. The other pieces that are critical to it, and as I learn more as I go along, probably one of the most critical is the top bubble, which goes right across, and that's communication and stakeholder engagement, which means externally and internally. And we've got folks, Elizabeth from the Stakeholder Engagement Office has been involved in this. We got our communications folks involved in this. Charlene's been huge on the change management aspect, and she told us that right at the beginning. That is going to be one of the biggest issues you have to deal with, and yeah, sure. And we're learning as we go down. It is, without question, one of the toughest things. It's to do these kinds of things and convince people, first off, something's changed here, and we need to get ahead of that. And then we have to let them know, what does this mean? How's it going to impact on your jobs? And a lot of people want to know that. It could be very minimal to a lot, depending on how far we're willing to go with some of this. So as an example, with the Duvernay team, we're testing a multidisciplinary approach. So the idea is we're setting it up for a play, and we're going to test these processes. So a project plan comes in. Those folks will be responsible to look at that plan and determine, does it meet the requirements that we've set out? But they'll be doing it differently than we typically would, where you'd go to applications branch, who might throw a piece into the geology folks to look at, or economics folks, where it's kind of fragmented. The idea here is the same team looks at the whole thing from start to finish, and then meets with the companies. If there's 4 or 5 different operators, they'll meet with all 4 or 5 operators and understand what's going on in the field, understand what's working. They'll be the ones that'll be looking at the performance measures to see Are they meeting the requirements? Or they may look at it and say, we don't have enough data, we got to get better data. So it's a new way of operating. If it works, which we don't know, and that's why we want to test it, it could lead to a different way we do our business totally. And it doesn't necessarily just apply to unconventional. The good pieces we can expand and take further if it works. So science and information, that's getting, we need to know where the shales are. We need to know where the groundwater is. There's a whole bunch of information we need to learn, and we're working with the AGS folks that are giving us some really good information on that. Some is going to be published here fairly shortly. So part of the exercise will be, what tools do they need to efficiently go through lots of information quickly and make good decisions? So this is where we're working with the EDT folks and ERCB Connect to figure out how can we look at lots of information very quickly to make good decisions. Because if we can't do that, this isn't going to work. I mean, we need technology to help us through this process. So, okay, so that's really what the concept looks like. This is going to talk about some of the things that we're working on right now that we hope to deliver on the next little while. So we split them into short-term deliverables, which is from now into the fall, medium term, which puts us into January, February timeframe, and then we're to be complete the project by the end of 2013. So that's the longer term. So short term, we're looking at the fracture fluid chemical disclosure requirements. That's in flight right now, and we're working closely with BC Oil and Gas. They have bought the rights to a website called fracfocus.ca, which was developed in the United States, and we're using that as our choice because it's already half the work's done. But there's a lot of effort in getting compliance on submission requirements and in getting stuff up and running. So the EDT folks have been working very, very hard. There's about, I think, a team of about almost a dozen people now working full bore at trying to get this done and ready by the fall. What we're looking at doing, it's not on this slide because I actually showed this slide to Cap and I didn't want to get them all in a knot yet, but we're looking at likely putting out a hydraulic fracturing directive over the next, and we're trying to do this differently too and do it in a very short time frame, but it would include pretty much everything that's on here. So fracture fluid chemical disclosure requirements. Another one is around notification to the field office when somebody wants to conduct a frac. Let them know that it's going on, and that